Hello, this is Comrade Darkslayer, and today in this video, I'll be talking about anarchism, Marxism, socialism, and why we need a revolution. This is why we need a revolution. And in this video, we'll be exposing the power elite, the New World Order, and why we need a revolution in this country, and why we need like a Marxist, anarchist revolution in this country, and so on and so forth. And I'll be presenting to you evidence for that, and I'll be discussing that here. In this video, I'll be presenting to you evidence and video clips of of exposing the power elite, revolution in this country, and I'll be exposing the New World, and I'll be exposing the power elite and the New World Order here, and I'll be showcasing why we need a Marxist revolution in this country, why we need an anarchism in this country, why we need a Marxist anarchist revolution in this country, and what we need to do to save our country, and so on and so forth. And that's what I'll be discussing here in this video and showcasing here in this video. And that's what I'll be presenting here in this video, and that's what I'll be talking about here in this video. So here we go, and here it is.
So all you're willing to say is that you know that Anne Frank wrote part of the diary, but she did not write all of it. Is that correct?
No, perhaps most of it she did not write. In a sense, what is probably what did happen. Anne Frank did write something, and a lot of this was edited, and his publisher in Germany made against a fellow at Hamburg, and this trial is still pending. For good reasons, I think. It's probably they are waiting for this man who is quite old to die, because it's so obvious that Anne Frank is a hoax.
This man that they're waiting for to die in Hamburg is someone who had claimed, as you do, that the diary of Anne Frank is a hoax, and her father and the publisher took him to court. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
And as a result of that court hearing, an investigation was made into the means of the writing of the book, and it was revealed that a ballpoint pen was used, which had not been invented at that time.
Yes, and I like to add here that Mr. Otto Frank gave this group who did the investigation plenty of difficulties.
It is an undisputed fact of history that during World War II, the Germans ran a network of prison and labor camps both in Germany and in the territories they controlled. Into these camps were sent Jews, prisoners of war, resistance fighters, gypsies, and other people considered enemies of the Third Reich. The largest of these camps was the one called Auschwitz, located in Poland. Those interned at Auschwitz came from all over Europe and consisted of men, women, and children. Those able to work were used as labor for the German war effort. Auschwitz was liberated by the Soviet Army in January of 1945. But that is where the consensus ends. Since the end of World War II, we have been told repeatedly that many of these camps served a darker purpose. The genocide of 6 million Jews and the execution of 5 million non-Jews through the use of homicidal gas chambers in what is now commonly known as the Holocaust. The largest number of people are said to have been murdered at Auschwitz. But there are some people who maintain that these claims of mass murder have never been proven. These people point to the lack of documentation other than the highly questionable and already partially discredited evidence supplied by the Soviet Union at the Nuremberg trial, and the unreliable nature of the eyewitness testimonies, many of which have also been discredited. For example, many former camp inmates, as well as American soldiers, still speak of gassings at the Dachau camp in Germany, even though it is no longer held that any gas chamber was ever in use at that camp. Still, the Holocaust is an event that has seemingly grown in importance since the end of the war, taught as fact, usually accepted without question. But how do we know if it really happened? What proofs are offered for those not willing to take history on faith alone? This video deals with, among other things, one of those proofs. One piece in a very large puzzle, the supposed gas chamber at the Auschwitz main camp. This tape is the first in a series of tapes covering my September 1992 trip to Europe to investigate firsthand the sites of the alleged final solution. It is by no means intended to be the last word on the Holocaust controversy, but just the opposite. I hope this tape can begin an open debate that's long overdue. What is fact and what is simple wartime propaganda regarding the event we have come to know as the Holocaust? This is the Auschwitz main camp, or Stammlager. There are three parts to what is known as Auschwitz. There is Auschwitz I, the main camp, a well-built compound which existed before World War II as a military barracks, and was slightly modified by the Germans when they took it over. Then there's Auschwitz II, also known as Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was constructed during the war as an expansion of the main camp. And there's Auschwitz III, or Auschwitz-Monowest, to work. It is Auschwitz I, the main camp, which is the center of Auschwitz tourism. It is here that tours are conducted hourly in English, Polish, German, and French. By their own figures, over 500,000 people visit here every year, and the place has become a curious shrine, a mix of crass commercialism and religious reverence, with a hotel, restaurant, gift shop, and booths selling all manner of video equipment, like batteries and videotapes in all formats, so that no one need worry about missing a shot of the final solution. This is a shrine which combines Catholic expressions of identity and mourning with Jewish ones, and this has traditionally caused some tension. Jewish groups have charged that the Poles downplay the role of Jewish suffering, and while few would openly suggest it, it could be said that, in the West, Jews have attempted to monopolize Auschwitz as a uniquely Jewish experience. Already we reach an important point in our examination of the Holocaust. It is an event interpreted differently in various corners of the world. The Soviets have always stressed the suffering of Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, and others. Post-World War II Soviet propaganda films often made little mention of Jews. To the Polish locals, Auschwitz is given a Catholic face, with all the usual fetishes. The suffering of Polish priests and other martyrs is stressed, and the attempted extermination of the Polish people is the preferred theme. But in the Western world we get a single-mindedly Jewish interpretation, with the non-Jewish deaths being used mainly to keep non-Jewish interest in the Holocaust alive by giving non-Jews some involvement in it. But we are told that even though non-Jews suffered as well, it is the Jews and the Jews only who were marked for extermination. This schism has often resulted in well-publicized disputes, such as the convent of Carmelite nuns who took up residence here at Auschwitz against the wishes of many Jewish groups, and the time a touring Polish Auschwitz exhibit was protested for not being Jewish enough. However, at the camp itself, there's more than enough victimization to go around. The layout of the Auschwitz main camp is fairly simple. A square of barbed wire fence surrounds rows and rows of inmates' barracks, a large mess hall, and a few surprises, which we will get to later. Outside the fenced-in area are the SS headquarters, these two buildings, and the SS hospital and restaurant. Across from that is the building known as Crematorium I, the infamous gas chamber and crematorium. Most of the inmates' barracks have been converted into museums, which make up the bulk of the guided tour. The rest of the barracks are used as either archives or offices for museum staff. One barrack, Block 11, has been kept in its original state. It was the camp prison, and it is now referred to, naturally, as the Block of Death. Which brings up another interesting point. What is shown on the tour and what is not? During the tour you are shown the Block of Death, the so-called Wall of Death, naturally right next door to the Block of Death, and exhibit after exhibit specifically designed to affirm atrocity stories and portray Auschwitz as a death machine, a place where internment meant extermination. But what don't they show you? To start with, a building which could conceivably be called the Block of Life, a massive disinfestation complex where Zyklon B gas was used daily to combat lice and the disease they carried. These were the real gas chambers, except their victims were clothing and mattresses, and their purpose was to preserve the health of the inmates. Holocaust experts don't deny the purpose of this building. They just don't like mentioning it. After all, why complicate things? Also forgotten is the Auschwitz Camp Theater, the current home of the aforementioned convent of nuns. The last pictures taken inside this building showed pianos and costumes and a stage where the inmates used to put on productions. These days, however, the nuns don't allow pictures to be taken inside. And finally, we have the Auschwitz swimming pool. Yes, that's right, swimming pool, situated inside the prison compound, right alongside the inmates' barracks. A beautiful pool with a diving board and starters blocks for races. To their credit, the Auschwitz camp officials have not tried to remove this distraction, but if you want to see the pool, you need to know already that it exists, because you won't find it on the tour. So basically, what we have is a tour that consists mainly of tourists who already believe in the Holocaust story and are perhaps emotionally connected to it in some way, being given a selectively edited tour filled with horror story after horror story, and ending up at the final stop, the gas chamber. At that point, the tour group is emotionally primed to believe anything, and the gas chamber is like the featured performer after a 2-hour warm-up act to get the crowd in the mood. Literally, the gas chamber is the objective proof that everything they've heard on the tour is true, objective proof of the Holocaust. But is it? We'll see in a minute. I went to Auschwitz in September of 1992 to see for myself this place that I have studied for so long. I paid extra for a personal English-language tour guide, a young lady named Alicia who gives tours in Polish, German, and English. And I wore my yarmulke, just so nobody missed the point that I'm Jewish. I figured that way I could ask my questions in a manner that would not make me look like a revisionist. You see, in the past, revisionists haven't had much success in getting answers from the Auschwitz officials. But I would come off as a righteous Jew, wanting to know the real facts, and answer those who say the Holocaust never happened. For the sake of clarity, not only am I a revisionist, I am also quite proudly an atheist. But my parents are both Jewish, so if you're a Jew by birth, you're a Jew by birth. It's not anything I'd be ashamed of. Alicia, like the other tour guides, had to take a class and memorize a spiel to become one. This is an important point because I'm hoping to show that the people who run Auschwitz, like Dr. Franciszek Pieper and the tour guide supervisor you'll meet shortly, teach their tour guides to say things they know aren't true. But this shouldn't reflect badly on Alicia. She only repeats what she's been told, and I'm sure she never had to put up with a tourist like me before. I have over 4 hours of footage of me taking the tour, asking one obnoxious question after another. This footage will be re-edited into a separate tape. This time we're just going to concern ourselves with the gas chamber and my interview with Dr. Franciszek Pieper, senior curator and head of archives at the Auschwitz State Museum. I came to Auschwitz as a confirmed skeptic about the gas chamber story. I know to some people critically examining the Holocaust is the ultimate sacrilege, but you'll have to realize that I have no sacred cows, and understanding what really happened is important to me, and I'd ask that you respect that. I know from years of my own research, and the research of others, that proofs of the Holocaust are few. Literally, all there is are the eyewitness testimonies and post-war confessions. There is no picture, plan, or wartime document dealing with homicidal gas chambers or a plan to exterminate the Jews. And we can't use the excuse that the Nazis destroyed all the evidence, because after we had broken the German code, we were able to intercept their secret transmissions, including those that came from Auschwitz. The key to understanding the Holocaust story is understanding the true nature of the things passed off as proofs. Everything that is used as evidence of the Holocaust also can be said to have a perfectly normal explanation. For example, these exhibits are said to be the material proofs of exterminations. There's the piles of human hair. But what does that prove? It's acknowledged that each inmate had his or her head shaved because of the lice problem. That's not denied, so why wouldn't there be piles of human hair? What about the piles of shoes and clothing? Is that a proof? It's a fact that the prisoners were issued a uniform upon arrival, including shoes. So why wouldn't there be piles of inmates' shoes and clothing? It doesn't prove anybody was killed. And that's giving the Soviets and Poles the benefit of the doubt that the clothes and hair are genuinely from the camp during its operation. What about the canisters of gas? No one denies that Zyklon B was used to disinfect clothes and also buildings. Zyklon B was one of the premier pest control agents in Europe at that time. It was present in most of the concentration camps, including those that are not said to have had homicidal gas chambers in them. The typhus epidemic that spread throughout Europe during the war, and also spread through the camps, called for stringent lice control procedures. In his book, Auschwitz, Technique and Operation of the Gas Chambers, published by the Klarsfeld Foundation and meant to refute revisionists, Jean-Claude Pressac admits that over 95% of the Zyklon B used by the Germans was used to disinfect. He assigns only 5% to homicidal purposes, and this from a Holocaust supporter. So what other proofs are offered? Well, there's the usual pictures of sick inmates, which proves the groundbreaking thesis that people got sick in the camp. Once again, I'll add that nobody denies the typhus epidemic, which resulted in many deaths. Then there's the artwork, and the pictures of children. But at this point, it's looking pretty bad for somebody looking for objective proofs of the gas chamber. And some of the proofs they present actually work against the concept. For example, they have one of several aerial photographs taken of Auschwitz by the Allies during the war. They don't mention, however, that when blown up, these photos don't show people being gassed or bodies being burned, even though they were taken during the time killings were said to be going on almost non-stop. I won't even go into the special money the Germans printed for Auschwitz inmates, or the fact that even though it is said that Jewish children were killed immediately, both Anne Frank and her sister were sent to Auschwitz and survived, later being transferred to the Bergen-Belsen camp, where they are said to have died from typhus. But all this bickering would be pointless if we could see a genuine gas chamber for ourselves. That, of course, would most effectively end the argument. Which brings us to the building I'm standing in front of. The gas chamber and crematorium died from typhus. But all this bickering would be pointless if we could see a genuine gas chamber for ourselves. That, of course, would most effectively end the argument. Which brings us to the building I'm standing in front of. The gas chamber and crematorium. Pictures of this building have been featured in book after book on the Holocaust. After all, what better proof it all happened? Revisionists don't dispute that this is a real building from during the war. We say that it was indeed a crematorium and a mortuary, which also was used as an air raid shelter for the SS men in the hospital and restaurant right across the street from it. The Auschwitz people say it was indeed a mortuary and a crematorium, with the mortuary part, which you're looking at right there, later being used as the gas chamber. They also say that it was used as an air raid shelter. And they have, in the past, admitted that the large brick chimney at the side of the building is a reconstruction, which is no big shock to anybody because it clearly isn't connected to the building in any way. Now let's go inside. Once inside, we can see why revisionists have had such a field day with this building. Obvious marks on the walls and floors, where apparently walls had been knocked down, equally obvious holes in the floor where bathroom facilities had been. We maintain that, unlike the large hollow chamber we now see, this room had once been 5 rooms, including a bathroom. I should add that there is no Zyklon B blue staining in the walls, as there would have been with repeated Zyklon B use, and as there were and still are in the disinfestation chambers. A flimsy wooden door with a big glass pane in it, and a doorway with no door and no fittings for a door leading to the crematorium ovens. And I should also mention the big manhole right in the middle of the gas chamber. Yet the building does have what appears to be evidence of criminal usage. 4 holes in the ceiling, which lead to the roof, where 4 little chimneys stand. It is said that through these 4 holes, Zyklon B crystals were dropped. and indeed there seems to be no other explanation for them. Do these holes prove homicidal gassings? Revisionists have claimed in the past that these holes were added after the camp's liberation, and that the inside walls were knocked down and the bathroom facilities removed to make the room look like a big gas chamber. As Alicia and I approached the building, we passed the gallows where the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, was hanged by the Soviets in 1947, executed directly in front of the evidence of his crime. Here, in front of the gas chamber, I ask Alicia about the authenticity of that building. Now let's start again talking about this building here. This
crematorium gas chamber.
But this is a reconstruction.
It is in original state. Original state.
Now there, Alicia has very clearly represented the gas chamber as being in its original state. Once inside, I asked her specifically about the 4 holes in the ceiling. Are those the original holes in the ceiling?
It is in original part. Original.
That is original.
Original through this chimney was dropped cyclone beam.
I then asked Alicia if any walls had ever been knocked down in the room exhibited as the gas chamber. So this part was all the gas chamber.
Mm-hmm.
Were there walls here at one time?
But here, it was only one room. Only one room. That here I know here. When here I show picture of gas chamber, it was only one room here.
So were there ever were walls here?
No.
Let's pause here to recap the gas chamber according to our tour guide. She states that the room is in its original state, that the ceiling holes are original, and that no walls were knocked down. Unsatisfied with her answers, I continued to badger poor Alicia about the real history of this room, feeling somewhat exasperated at the fact that nothing she could say would shut me up. Alicia went to get a woman who was introduced to me as the supervisor of tour guides for the Auschwitz State Museum. When I saw this woman approach, I figured I was either going to get a straight answer or kicked out of the camp.
This is what I can suggest. It will be much better to go to our scientists in the State Museum and to talk with. They show you a lot of plans which we still have in the archives.
Where would that be?
I don't think that it's open today, but probably in Monday it will be possible.
That's the Auschwitz State Museum?
Yes.
Is that in Oswiecim?
Here, in block number
in
24 and 23, I'm not sure about
Would
this.
it be possible for me to make an appointment to see him on Monday, perhaps?
That's true.
So it was here that it was first suggested I meet with the head of archives and senior curator, Dr. Franciszek Pieper. Still, fearing that such a meeting might not come about, and assuming that the supervisor was probably in the loop regarding any reconstructions, I decided to get her input regarding the supposedly original holes in the ceiling. Are those the original holes in the ceiling?
No.
They've been rebuilt?
Yes,
Okay. After the war?
after the war.
So, if you're keeping score, that makes it 1 vote for original, 1 vote for not original. I guess that would make Dr. Pieper the tiebreaker. Now, before we proceed any further, a little digression is needed about some genuine Holocaust revisionism. Dr. Franciszek Pieper is one of the Holocaust experts most directly responsible for the lowering of the Auschwitz death count. Along with other scholars like Israeli Holocaust expert Dr. Yehuda Bauer, it was decided around 1989 to admit publicly that fewer people died at Auschwitz than had previously been reported. In his book, Auschwitz, How Many Perished, Dr. Pieper concludes that the old Soviet-provided figure of 4 million is wrong, and that the real figure is closer to 1.1 million. Now that's no small revision, an admission that the Soviets exaggerated the figure by almost 4 times. We can also see how the fraudulent figure has been an ingrained part of supposedly factual Holocaust history for almost 50 years. As late as 1988, In the official Auschwitz State Museum guidebook, you'll find on page 19 an official affirmation of the 4 million figure. The Soviet State Extraordinary Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes stated that no less than 4 million people perished in Auschwitz. The Supreme National Tribunal in Poland stated that about 4 million persons perished in Auschwitz. According to the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, more than 4 million persons perished in Auschwitz. And these figures are based upon the evidence of hundreds of surviving prisoners and upon the opinion of experts. Well, this shows that not only was fraudulent Soviet evidence admitted as fact at Nuremberg, but also that survivors and experts can be wrong. And, if it matters, many Holocaust revisionists believe that the actual total of dead at Auschwitz is even less than 1.1 million. But still, there is no possibility that even the most extreme Holocaust revisionist in the world could possibly revise the figure any more than the Holocaust experts already have. Which rather neatly brings us to this man, Dr. Franciszek Pieper. I interviewed him in his office at the Auschwitz State Museum. At first, he was a little apprehensive about being videotaped. But I explained to him that since I already had the tour guide on tape, giving out what I had now come to believe was incorrect information, I should have a videotape which could set the record straight. Once he consented, I immediately asked him about changes made in the gas chamber.
The first and oldest gas chamber which existed in Auschwitz I, this camp we are now here, operated from autumn 1941 to December 1942, approximately 1 year. Crematorium nearby this gas chamber worked longer to the middle of 1943. In July 1943, the crematorium was stopped and the bodies of the prisoners died in Auschwitz I were from the time transferred to Birkenau. In 1944, in connection with the bombardment of Auschwitz by Allies air forces, empty crematorium number 1 and gas chamber in Auschwitz I were adopted as air shelter. The additional walls were built inside the former gas chamber. The additional entrance was made from the east side of the gas chamber, and the openings in the ceiling, the gas cyclone B was discharged inside, were at the time liquidated. So, after the liberation of the camp, the former gas chamber presented the view of air shelter. In order to gain the earlier sight of this object, the inside walls built in 1944 were removed, and the opening in the ceiling were made anew. So now this gas chamber is very similar to this one which existed in 1941-1942. But not all details were made there, so there is no gas-tight doors, for instance, additional entrance from the east side. arrested as it was made in 1944. Such changes were made here after the war in order to gain the real view of this object.
Were the holes in the ceiling put in the same way that they were?
Yes, in the same place, because the traces were visible on the ceiling.
Here, I think we should recap what Dr. Pieper has told us. According to him, the room was a gas chamber, but was later turned into an air raid shelter, at which time dividing walls were built, the holes in the ceiling were removed, and a new door was added on one side of the gas chamber. However, after the camp's liberation, the dividing walls were knocked down, the holes were put in the ceiling, however, the new door was not removed. I think here there are three main points that have to be made. The first of these is that we are looking at a clear deception. As I have shown, the gas chamber is shown off to tourists as being in its original state, even though the museum officials know better. Dr. Pieper appears to be very nonchalant about the fact that changes were made after the war. But if it isn't such a big deal, then why hide it from the tourists? And that's not all. In May of 1992, British historian David Irving was fined by a German court for telling a meeting in Munich exactly what you've just heard Dr. Pieper tell you. In fact, Pieper was even called as a defense witness, but the judge wouldn't allow him to testify, even though it might have cleared Irving. Once again, I'll say, if this is not such a big deal, why fine somebody for saying it? Our next point is, the gas chamber is no longer valid as proof in its present state. It is not a proof of homicidal gassings unless it can be shown that, at some time during the war, this building had 4 holes in the ceiling and no dividing walls, during the time the Germans were operating the camp. Which brings us to our final point. The reconstruction itself. With the information we now have, we can say that there are 2 different views of the gas chamber reconstruction. The first one, the official view, holds that the Soviets and Poles created a gas chamber in an air raid shelter that had been a gas chamber. The revisionist view holds that the Soviets and Poles created a gas chamber in an air raid shelter that had been an air raid shelter. So, how do we know which one is correct? Well, obviously the burden of proof is on those who say that there was a gas chamber at one time in that building. Do they have any evidence at all to support that claim? In my tenure as a Holocaust revisionist, I'm sure if there was any, I'd have seen it. I can also add that those questionable 4 holes in the roof of the building are not detectable in any of the aerial photograph blow-ups that I've seen. To get to the truth of this matter, there are some other pertinent questions that can be asked. If there was at one time a functioning gas chamber in this building, why was its operation halted, especially if the Nazis were running Auschwitz as an extermination center? Well, Dr. Pieper has an answer for that one, too. In an essay published in the Polish book Auschwitz, Pieper writes that exterminations were moved to new gas chambers in the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex because it had become too difficult to keep the gas chamber at the Auschwitz main camp a secret from the inmates. This has apparently become part of official Auschwitz lore because it's something that Alicia repeated to me on the tour.
In spite of, this crematorium was next to blocks where the prisoners lived. That's why extermination was moved to Birkenau. That's why 4 crematoriums with gas chambers were built in Birkenau.
Now, let's be perfectly clear about this. They say that exterminations were moved to Birkenau because the gas chamber at the main camp was too close to the inmates and therefore they could know what was going on. But is this even remotely accurate? Let's refer back to our map of the main camp. Now here's the gas chamber right there, and there's the rows of inmates' barracks. As you can see, the gas chamber is well outside of the prison compound and is hidden from view by the 3 SS buildings, which effectively hide it from the inmates' sight. Plus, we're told that arrivals who were going to be gassed would be taken in through here, thus avoiding any and all contact with the other inmates. This was a gas chamber that could have functioned completely isolated from anybody's notice. Now this is Auschwitz-Birkenau, in an Allied aerial photo from September 1944. Actively hide it from the inmates' sight. Plus, we're told that arrivals who were going to be gassed would be taken in through here, thus avoiding any and all contact with the other inmates. This was a gas chamber that could have functioned completely isolated from anybody's notice. Now this is Auschwitz-Birkenau in an Allied aerial photo from September 1944. These are the two crematoriums and gas chambers, with the crematoriums above ground and an L-shaped below-ground rooms that were either gas chambers or mortuaries. And here you have the rows and rows of inmates' barracks. Now the thing that becomes immediately clear is there is nothing but a barbed wire fence hiding the inmates' barracks from the gas chambers. And this over here was the Auschwitz sports field right next door to the gas chambers. And another thing to notice is not only could you see the gas chamber parallel with the barracks, but you could see diagonally to the one across the way from you. Nothing was hidden from the inmates. Another interesting thing was the train that would come up carrying the doomed inmates. You would have thousands of inmates being marched off the trains into one of these two gas chambers in full view of the entire camp. This was a spectacle that nobody at the camp could miss. They would see thousands of people marching into those buildings and nobody coming out. These were gas chambers that were not isolated from anyone, and indeed, when these aerial photographs were released in the late 70s, they contradicted many supposed eyewitness claims about how the Nazis had tried to camouflage the gas chambers at Birkenau. I spent several days here at Birkenau, and the footage I have, which is available on a separate tape, dramatically shows everything I've just been saying. Frankly, I don't think Pieper's claim holds any water. Another question that should be asked, is there any Zyklon B residue in the gas chamber, knowing that cyanide gas would in fact leave a residue? In 1988, execution equipment expert Fred Lucher conducted forensic examinations on the gas chambers at Auschwitz. To answer that question, he took samples from the 4 gas chambers at Birkenau, the one at the main camp, and a control sample from one of the disinfestation chambers that we know did use Zyklon B. Now, the gas chamber samples showed almost no appreciable traces, whereas the disinfestation sample literally went right off the scale. More importantly, though, in 1990, the Institute of Forensic Research in Krakow decided to conduct their own forensic tests to see if they could refute Fred Lucher's findings, and they did this with Dr. Pieper's help. And their own tests got back the same results. So since then, the question has not been, are there any appreciable traces of Zyklon B residue in the gas chambers, but instead, why are there not any appreciable traces? I put this question to Dr. Pieper. I asked him, why are there so few appreciable traces in the homicidal gas chambers compared to the large amounts of traces found in the disinfestation chambers?
Gas chamber, gas Zyklon B was operated very short time, about 20, 30 minutes during 24 hours, and in the disinfection rooms it operated the whole day and night. And such was the procedure of using gas in disinfection rooms and in gas chamber.
Now let's be perfectly clear about what Dr. Pieper is saying. I ask him, why is the residue count high in the delousing chambers but low in the homicidal ones? And he answers because the delousing chambers were used, quote, day and night, whereas the homicidal ones were used, quote, about 20-30 minutes. The reason it was so difficult to ascertain the number of victims at Auschwitz was because the Nazis had destroyed the appropriate records. This concept was also repeated to me by Dr. Pieper. Who initially came up with the figure of 4 million people dying at Auschwitz?
It was estimating made by Soviet Commission for Investigating of Nazi crimes in Auschwitz, because because of the fact that the Nazis destroyed the documents of the camp.
But in fact, the Auschwitz camp death records were held by the Soviets, not released until 1989. These documents were not destroyed by the Nazis. I think we can assume that during all those years the Soviets were handing out their exaggerated death figures. They knew they had these books in their possession. We can also look at discredited charges made by the Soviets and supported by the other Allies at the Nuremberg trial. The Soviets claimed that there were steam chambers for killing inmates at the Treblinka camp in Poland. Now, the Soviets actually submitted supposed Jewish soap at the Nuremberg trial, but today, Holocaust scholars like Raoul Hilberg, Yehuda Bauer, and Deborah Lipstadt agree that these accusations are groundless. In a Los Angeles Times editorial from 1981, Deborah Lipstadt is quoted as saying, "The fact is that the Nazis never used the bodies of Jews, or for that matter anyone else, for the production of soap. The soap rumor was prevalent both during and after the war. It may have had its origin in the cadaver factory atrocity story that came out of World War I. The soap rumor was thoroughly investigated after the war and proved to be untrue." The questions this raises are numerous. If the claim is false, then that means the Soviets were not being truthful about that hunk of soap they exhibited as evidence, and all the Nuremberg transcripts dealing with human soap are wrong. But my question is, when were these charges thoroughly investigated, as she says? This is just another case of a Holocaust expert trying to make us believe that Holocaust experts know what they're talking about and are straight about what did and didn't happen, which they are not. To prove my point, I submit the fact that Dr. Pieper still believes in the human soap story.
There were such attempts of using the human flesh for producing of soap in other concentration camp, Stutthof by Gdańsk.
So that was where it was done.
There were made such attempts.
Apparently, some war propagandas never seem to die. Indeed, the specter of fraudulent Holocaust evidence from the Soviets has reared its head in more current events, like the prosecution of Ukrainian-American John Demjanjuk, whose incredibly flawed war crimes conviction was based, in part, on faulty Soviet evidence. And speaking of fraudulent evidence, some Holocaust experts seem to have difficulty explaining the difference between what's fraudulent and what's real. We return briefly to Jean-Claude Pressac's book on Auschwitz, a book meant to refute revisionists. Here he shows us a picture of a gas-tight door from a delousing room which he claims the Soviets falsely represented to be from a homicidal gas chamber. Yet several pages later, he shows us a door which he claims is a genuine homicidal gas chamber door because of the metal hemispherical grid protecting the peephole. Pressac offers this door as a proof that homicidal gassings occurred, but there's just one unanswered question. How does Pressac know that this door, too, isn't a Soviet put-on? If we admit that the Soviets went around misrepresenting and reconstructing things, how can we tell a difference between what's real and what's not? In the case of that supposedly genuine door with the metal grid over the peephole, I asked Dr. Pieper if I could see it for myself. In Pressac's book, he has a picture of a gas-tight door with a metal grid around the peephole. Is that still around any place? Does that still exist?
It is in one of the room of crematorium.
Crematorium 1?
Yes, in crematorium.
Is it possible for me to see that?
You may go to the director, and director will order to open you. It is visible
through a window?
Through the window.
I'd very much like to see that. Well, guess what? After the interview, we went to the director's office, got the keys, and explored every room in Crematorium 1, and no homicidal gas chamber door with a metal grid over the peephole. No one knew where it went. I guess it simply vanished, like magic. So, in answer to our question about precedent regarding Soviet trustworthiness, I think we've established that we can't really accept anything on faith, because evidence certified as real one year might be considered fake the next, evidence you are told is genuine can, in fact, be a so-called reconstruction. With all this talk about Soviet deception, I think it's necessary to put this matter in its proper historical perspective. You see, we live in a time now when the old Soviet Union has fallen apart, and it's now okay for both liberals and conservatives, as well as everybody else, to speak ill of the dear departed communist state. But it was not always that way. During World War II, the Soviets were more than just a military ally. Their anti-Nazi propaganda was readily accepted by the other allies because it served all of their purposes. It has to be understood that Russia's communists and Germany's fascists had had a long-running propaganda battle, both before the Hitler-Stalin Non-Aggression Pact and, of course, after, with the outbreak of war. Both Stalin and Hitler were men capable of, and quite adept at, propaganda, yet the vestiges of our acceptance of Soviet propaganda still linger to this day. For example, when we see an anti-communist German poster, we most likely immediately dismiss it as paranoid Nazi anti-communist propaganda. Yet are we so conditioned to dismiss a similar Soviet work as paranoid anti-fascist propaganda? The point is that we have a hard time realizing that Stalin's anti-German propaganda was just as virulent as Hitler's anti-Soviet propaganda, and that, as the victors, the Soviets got to commit their propaganda to the history books as fact. But all charges and countercharges made during World War II must be re-examined with the 20/20 hindsight we now have, the knowledge of Stalin's despotism, and the KGB's history of misinformation and deception. And this re-examination must include the charges of genocide made against the Nazis, especially considering that for Auschwitz, as well as the other camps in Poland, Majdanek, Belzec, Chełmno, Treblinka, and Sobibor, we've had to rely on the Soviets for most of our information. And if the Soviets exaggerated the number of dead at Auschwitz, who's to say they didn't also do it at the other camps? Why would they exaggerate Auschwitz by 4 times and then be brutally honest about Treblinka? However, lest I appear to be unfair, it should be added that our own army and propaganda department did not sit idly by and let the Soviets have all the atrocity propaganda fun. After the war, it was claimed at the Dachau camp that people were gassed. In fact, the army produced several propaganda films supporting that notion.
Hanging in orderly rows were the clothes of prisoners who had been suffocated in a lethal gas chamber. They had been persuaded to remove their clothing under the pretext of taking a shower, for which towels and soap were provided.
Yet now it is no longer claimed that anyone ever died in a Dachau gas chamber. This is a clear case of wartime propaganda. It should also be added, in fairness, that it was the British who obtained, by torture, the confession of Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, before turning him over to the Soviets and Poles. This has been confirmed in a book published in 1983 titled Legions of Death, which contains the recollections of British Sergeant Bernard Clark, who brags about having tortured Höss to get a confession out of him and of threatening his family. Which brings us back to Auschwitz. It was here, behind the building we've talked so much about, the supposed gas chamber, that Höss was hanged for running an extermination camp. But can we say now that that was a just sentence, with the main evidence being a confession obtained by torture and a reconstructed air raid shelter? Perhaps you will answer that the sentence was still a just one because of the fact that he indeed ran an internment camp where people did die in large numbers from disease and malnutrition. But then, what should have been done with the American troops who ran the internment camps we had in the United States for the Japanese, or more appropriately, to General Eisenhower and his troops, who ran post-war POW camps for the Germans, in which anywhere from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million Germans died also because of disease and malnutrition. Should they have been hanged too? When does war end and war crimes begin? These questions have no easy answers, and this debate is far from over.
Now, we all know that these horrible scenes depict 6 million of the Jews who were gassed under the National Socialist regime of Adolf Hitler in homicidal gas chambers. Here we are on a private tour of a typical Nazi gas chamber. Here we have the ramp going down into the gas chamber, the stains of Zyklon B on the ceiling, the reinforced walls to stop the victims from escaping, from crashing through the windows and running away. And here we are now down inside the very gas chamber itself with the fake shower heads all around the walls. The fake shower heads where no water ever sprayed out. Only Zyklon B gas came out. Here are the drainage runnels in the floor so that the SS men could hose down the place afterwards, after the gas chamber had done its deadly deed. Here in the ceiling are scratch marks in the very beams in the ceiling where the piles of victims have tried to claw their way out through the ceiling to escape this horrible death. Here are the fake shower heads where the Zyklon B gas was sprayed out from these massive installations, these pipes in the next room with the valves operated by the SS men. And here too is the changing room next door to the gas chamber where the victims were lured and tricked into believing that they were going to take a shower, where in fact they were going to their deaths. Here's a tiny remnant of one of the victims, and more drainage runnels for hosing down the room after the deadly deed. Benches where the people had their hair shaved by Jewish barbers, and here's the booth where the SS man sat and supervised. He was even such a fanatical Nazi, he had to paint a swastika on his desk while he supervised his innocent Jewish victims going to their deaths. Here are the massive extractor fans, more pipes and valves to channel the Zyklon B into the deadly gas chamber. Here are the hoses to hose down the place after the deadly deed, to hose down the blood, the menstrual fluid and the feces of the dying victims. Of course, the whole place is disguised as a very innocuous temple in the Greek style. Or is it? It could almost pass for an athletic club, or perhaps even a swimming pool. Well, is it a gas chamber, or is it a swimming pool? In fact, I think we've just demonstrated to you how easy it is to misrepresent perfectly ordinary facilities, in this case a municipal swimming pool in California, and a perfectly ordinary shower bath, and a perfectly ordinary ramp leading up to the swimming pool. We've been able to misrepresent those perfectly innocuous facilities as a homicidal gas chamber. And this just shows how easy it is to do this, how you can look at perfectly ordinary fixtures and make them out to be something horrendously horrible and homicidal. So in this little film you're about to see, we're going to demonstrate to you how the exterminationist historians have done this with the facilities in continental Europe.
No German can say he did not know about them. This was not used as a bathhouse, but as a death chamber. Batches of prisoners were marched in here to die. When the chamber was full, the doors were shut and sealed. A man at the controls let in the poison gas, and another batch of...
And a meeting room here at the hotel in connection with the convention of the California Library Association. Well, now the CLA at that time caved in to threats from the Los Angeles City Council and from the Jewish Defense League and so on, and they cancelled that booth and that meeting. But even before that, there were all kinds of things going on here. For example, in 1979, the Libertarian Party had their convention here that year, and I had just arrived in California about a year before that, and had just founded the IHR, the Institute for Historical Review. And so I came down here with my good friend John Bennett from Australia, who was over here in Los Angeles for the first IHR convention. We came down here to pass out flyers dealing with free speech on revisionism. We came down to pass those out to the libertarian attendees because we felt that those would be a good audience for that kind of free speech approach. Now, as far as we know, we passed out flyers to hundreds and maybe thousands of libertarian attendees. But out of all of those thousands of Libertarian Party attendees, there was only one person who actually responded, and that one person was, again, our good friend Bradley Smith. So let's turn now to Bradley, who happens to be here with us again, back at the scene of the crime, and find out exactly what went through his mind at that time. So Bradley, do you recall the night when you received the revisionist flyer from myself or John Bennett or whomever?
Well, I walked in on a Sunday morning of the Libertarian Presidential Nominating Convention, and what I ran into was a little man with white hair and a white beard who was handing out flyers, and these flyers were complaining. Essentially, he began a spiel with me, and his spiel was that libertarians supported a free press, but in this instance, they were refusing to accept books written to challenge the orthodox view of the Holocaust, and that he considered this as the suppression of free exchange of ideas, and he was here to complain to libertarians about the refusal to accept ads for these books, particularly Arthur Butz's The Hoax of the 20th Century. He was handing out flyers, and when I knew what he was talking about, all of a sudden I felt a real sense of shame, and the shame wasn't from anything that was inside me holding the flyers, but it was from the awareness that I was being observed by other libertarians receiving this flyer and looking at it, and in my mind thinking, they may think that I'm interested in this stuff. And so I decided that I would throw the flyer away, and I walked toward a trash can, and as I was walking over there, I happened to notice that the flyer had been translated from French, and it had appeared originally in Le Monde, and which is the internationally famous French daily. And I thought, well, I don't understand what this is. The paper was titled "The Rumor of Auschwitz," or it was called "The Question of Auschwitz: The Rumor of the Gas Chambers." I forget the exact title. And what is this doing, being published in Le Monde? And at the last minute, instead of throwing away, I folded it up, put it in my back pocket, so that on the one hand, I could have the pleasure of reading it, but on the other hand, I had the pleasure of showing all the libertarians who were watching me that I was unwilling to read it in public. And that night, when I got home to my room, where I was alone in Hollywood, I took it out in the dark, as it were, and like a thief in the night, I read these two little essays by Robert Faurisson. The one was by Faurisson and one by John Bennett from Australia. And in 20 minutes, this great dike of belief that had sustained me for 30 years in my belief in the Holocaust story had a crack in it. And I thought it possible, incredibly, that the gas chamber stories were not everything that I had always believed that they were.
Now, after you were first initiated to Holocaust revisionism through this flyer by this mysterious person at the Bonaventure Hotel here at the Libertarian Party Convention, what steps did you take to obtain revisionist books and to actually check out what these wild and crazy claims were?
Well, I didn't do anything for a while. I was certain that I was going to find out something. I felt certain that I was going to find out something, and I was very unsure that I wanted to find it out. And it's amazing that for the next 3 months, when I go back through my notes, I don't have a single note on what was going through my mind from the time I read this article by Forson and the one by Bennett, in which it seemed to me that their claims were so simple, they could be checked out so easily, that I felt almost certain there was something to it. 3 months passed until New Year's Eve, 1979. And on the afternoon of New Year's Eve, I called the downtown librarians down there and asked them if they shelved The Hoax of the 20th Century. And to my surprise, they did. So I hopped in the car and I got down there, and it was a very curious experience because, as I say, I was deadly afraid I was going to find out something that I really didn't want to find out, because I felt as if I were going to have some special obligation toward it if I found it out. And as I started to climb up the stairs, the front steps in the Los Angeles Public Library, I felt like this weight was on my shoulders, and each step I climbed, the weight got heavier on my shoulders, and it was laughable because I knew what was happening. I knew the psychological mechanism of it, and that as I went up each step, I knew that I was coming closer to accepting the burden of something that I figured could easily destroy what chances I had for a career as a writer. I got in the library, I got the Butts' book, I sat down at the table, and again I don't think I read for more than 45 minutes. And the first thing I realized was that the idea that 6 million Jews had been killed in World War II was an idea that could never be shown to be true one way or the other because of these giant, brutal population transfers that had taken place. And besides, no one knew what had happened in the Soviet Union at the end of the war. Nobody knew how many Jews were in Eastern Europe at the end of the war and how many ended up in the Soviet Union after the war. And no one has even tried to find out. It's beyond the pale. The second thing I found out was when Butts was describing the American military authorities torturing German prisoners preparatory to the trials for the Malmedy massacre. And essentially they were torturing them in order to get war crimes information from them. And it occurred to me two things. One was that the evidence that they were being tortured seemed to be on the public record. Two, it seemed I had spent 9 months in Vietnam a few years earlier. Plus I had been in Korea as a rifleman. And it seemed to me that this was something that the Americans were certainly capable of doing. And that if the Americans had done it, God only knows what the Soviets had done in order to get confessions from Germans. And the last reason was that why was it necessary for the Americans to torture Germans to get evidence of war crimes from them if the war crimes had been so self-evident to start with? Thousands and maybe tens of thousands of Germans have been accused of war crimes. Why was it necessary to torture a handful of additional Germans to get additional war crimes information? By the time I left the library that afternoon, I knew that I was in the revisionist game to one degree or another, and that if I chose to stay out of it, that I'd be betraying something in myself.
Now, Bradley, after you picked up this flyer about the hoax of the 20th century, I presume that you tried to investigate whether the claims in the book were legitimate and were valid. So did you try to check out if there were any book reviews about the hoax of the 20th century published in the New York Review of Books or the LA Times or any place?
Well, originally, of course, I didn't do anything. I didn't look for Butts' book, and I didn't look for any critical reviews of Butts' book. But after I read Butts' book, in fact, the same day, I started to search for critical reviews of this book. I couldn't find any. Over the next couple months, I made various stabs at the library. Finally, at the Santa Monica Library, I had the librarian help me, and we really spent about an hour trying to trace things down. And we couldn't find anything. Literally, Butts' book had not been reviewed. It had not been critiqued by any historians. Butts had not been interviewed from a historical perspective. There was a couple articles in the New York Times about him, telling the story about when it was discovered at Northwestern that someone on campus had written a book critical of Holocaust orthodoxy, that demonstrations have been organized by Jewish groups, Hillel particularly. And more than that, there wasn't anything. When I realized that no journalists, no historians, and not a single representative of our intellectual elites had bothered to tell us why we should not read this book, and specifically in what ways it was wrong, then I knew that we had a question in this country of program suppression or free exchange of ideas about the revisionist critique of Holocaust. I later learned that most Western European countries, including Canada, and in all of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, the free exchange of thought on the revisionist is censored by the state. And it's interesting that both the democracies and the Soviet-controlled societies consider this subject significant enough to censor.
When we were up on Hollywood Boulevard outside your former bookshop premises, you talked about the reaction of your liberal intellectual friends to your arrest and prosecution for daring to sell Tropic of Cancer out of your Bradley's bookstore at that time. When you discovered Holocaust revisionism and ventilated this subject with your liberal intellectual friends, what was their reaction in 1979? Compared to their reaction to your pornography charge in 1962?
Well, it's kind of interesting because when I was considered the champion of a free press in Los Angeles for refusing to hide Tropic of Cancer under the counter and to not sell it, the liberal community supported me entirely, and the real negative reactions that I had were, by and large, reactions from different sorts of Christian denominations and Christian individuals. Now, however, in the 80s, when it turns out that I think that books written by revisionists should have the same access to a free market, and that revisionist ideas should have the same access to a free press that literary ideas had in 2 decades ago, it turns out that Christians are not the people who are most against this. In the Christian community, there are pros and cons with respect to discussing revisionist scholarship, and the people who are really dead set against it are spokespeople for the Jewish community, particularly organized Jewish communities such as the Anti-Defamation League and the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. These people are, by their actions, and usually by their words, do whatever they can, not only to dismiss revisionist thought, but to actually suppress its expression, both on the electronic media and the print press and the universities. And in fact, they have been so assertive in their efforts at this that it's really become a taboo, so that everybody feels uncomfortable when a revisionist critiques any orthodox Holocaust position.
Now, besides the opposition of organized Jewish groups, what kind of reaction did you have from individual Jews who may have been your friends or relatives or whatever?
Well, they essentially have the viewpoint, since none of them know anything about revisionist scholarship. Individual Jews, like individual everybody else, consider revisionist scholarship as anathema and don't accept it, and usually always consider it as to be an expression of anti-Jewish feeling. They never discuss the subject at hand. It's very difficult for them because they don't know anything about it. And two, it's very hard for them to understand why anyone would even want. Their depth of belief is so deep that it's hard for them to understand why anybody would even ask these questions. The Jewish response to a critique of Holocaust orthodoxy today must be like the Christian response to atheist presentation 200 or 300 years ago in France or Germany, in which those who would speak from an atheist position or an agnostic position were just considered crazy. It's unusual in the sense that the Christians were worried that immoral, subjective feelings were being expressed in literature that was sexually frank, like the Henry Miller novel, whereas Jews seem to feel that the intellect itself is being betrayed by asking questions about what the Jewish community has been taught to believe totally. We're just as the agnostic 2 or 3 centuries ago was questioning the true belief of the Christians, and now the revisionists are questioning the true belief of the Jewish community. And it has the same kind of witch hunt behind the attempt to suppress it.
Well, here we are right across the street from the Bonaventure Hotel. This building happens to be the downtown headquarters of the Los Angeles Public Library System. And as you may have noticed from the earlier footage, this building suffered a big arson attack about 1 year ago and has been out of business ever since. They are making efforts to reconstruct the building and to restock it with books. And they're doing a pretty good job of it. It should be open by about this time next year. But right now, we'd like to talk about a different kind of book burning. The book burning of revisionist books, in particular this book, The Hoax of the 20th Century, which, as you may know, is the most vilified, the most hated book probably throughout American publishing. Now, this book was the one that was featured in the flyer which Bradley Smith was handed at the Libertarian Convention across the street. And this is the book which was actually on the shelves here at the LA Public Library. So let's ask Bradley what exactly happened when he came down here to the library to actually check out this book and how it all felt. So Bradley, what happened when you came down here to get the Hoax of the 20th Century? Did they have it on the shelves? And what did it feel like to take it off the shelf?
Well, at first I didn't do anything at all. In the notes that I have, I waited for 3 months before I ever made the decision to really check up and to see what was going on about this flyer that I'd read. And I think that I was afraid that I was going to find out something that I didn't want to find out. And the day, finally, on the last day of the year, on the afternoon of New Year's Eve, 1979, I called up the library to see if they had the book on the shelf. And surprisingly enough, they did. The lady said, well, she'd put it aside for you. I'd come down and get it. Well, I did, and when I got to the steps on the other side of the library, as I started to go up the steps, I noticed that my body each step I took, my body got heavier. And I realized what was happening psychologically. I felt like I was going to go into the library and read something and discover something that I didn't want to discover. But even though I knew what was happening, it was still happening. And when I went in and got the book, I remember the librarian, when the lady looked up at me from behind the desk, she didn't smile or anything, and I thought, my God, she knows that this is the guy who called her about that Nazi book, and now he's arrived to pick it up. And she has an idea about me that I'll never be able to get out of her mind. And of course she didn't say anything. She gave me the book and I looked at it. And I read the book for about 45 minutes and I discovered 2 or 3 things. One is that the book was very thoroughly referenced, that it was academic in nature, that it recounted material that was just simply too thoroughly referenced to dismiss out of hand, and that it had a couple particularly interesting things. And one was the outline of the way the Americans had treated the Germans in preparation for the Malmedy trial at Dachau, and that the Americans had found it necessary to torture the German soldiers in order to get evidence from them of war crimes. And it seemed to me, since the story was in public domain, it was reported in the press in Chicago and in New York, the story was too easily checked out to be wrong. And the other thing was that why, if the Germans, tens of thousands of Germans have been accused of war crimes, thousands of them are going to be hung for them, and the Americans found it necessary to torture a handful of Germans at Dachau in order to get proof of the war crimes at Malmedy. Something about this really seemed inappropriate to me. It seemed real. I thought it was probably true, and I figured that Butts really was into something, the revisionists were into something, and that it was too important to just let it slide.
Here at Auschwitz railway station, until at least 1943, most persons destined for the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp made their first stop.
In the past 10 years, we have visited most of the still existing concentration camps in Europe, including Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Oranienburg, Sachsenhausen and Neuengamme. We have gathered and studied the official information brochures and archives in the museums of these camps. We have interviewed cremation experts, chemists, engineers and some survivors of these camps. Dr. Frederick Tobin of the Adelaide-based Adelaide Institute has been studying the so-called Jewish Holocaust for more than 30 years. In April 1997, Dr. Tobin travelled to Poland to visit the most notorious of all World War II concentration camps, Auschwitz. Eyewitness testimonies, books and movies, ignoring the physical evidence, have all added to the legend of this most infamous camp. We say legend because the stories told by the books, movies and eyewitnesses have all been based on cruel wartime propaganda. And how many of you watching this video right now have ever gone to the trouble to find out if this propaganda is anywhere near true? This video is the culmination of many years' intensive study of the actual facts, the still existing evidence, and Dr. Tobin's visit to Auschwitz. All we ask of you is to listen to the evidence and judge for yourself.
This door opened into the air raid shelter. As you can see, it has a peephole, and as we open it inwards, you can see that it looks into or at a wall, befitting an air raid shelter. The first wall here, this vestibule, leads into the air raid shelter, where a second door this second door, you can see, is supposed to be gas tight? That is the problem anyone is faced with, worrying about this idea of having a gas chamber as I now open the door. This video offers a critical look at that part of World War II history called the Holocaust. In particular, of the alleged mass gassings of prisoners in German concentration camps. The Holocaust is always blamed on the German people, but a Holocaust on 6 million Jews was already being bemoaned in Jewish literature in 1919, at least 14 years before Adolf Hitler came to power. Since 1945, the Holocaust has been blown out of all historical context, and now worldwide there are more memorials reminding us of the Holocaust than there are of any other single event in history. Any person who honestly and openly questions the Holocaust dogma is attacked as being a racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, a hater. For over 50 years, the Jews and Germans alike have been suffering from the after effects of this hoax. Healing can only take place when the world is able to openly discuss the facts about this event. We named this video Judea Declares War on Germany because the historical facts show it was international Zionism that wanted to destroy Germany and Hitler, and not the other way around. Let me summarize a speech given by the Jewish millionaire businessman and political advisor, Mr. Benjamin Friedman, in Washington in 1961. Mr. Friedman knew exactly what he was talking about, because he was an insider at the highest levels within international Jewish organizations and a personal friend of at least 4 United States presidents. He was also a member of the 117-strong Zionist delegation at the signing of the Versailles Peace Treaty in Paris in 1919, where Germany was forced into bankruptcy and social chaos. Mr. Friedman says that 2 years into World War I, Germany, which then was winning the war, offered Great Britain and France a negotiated peace deal. But German Zionist groups, seeing an opportunity, made a deal with Britain and to get the United States into the war if Britain promised to give the Jews Palestine. The British agreed. And using blackmail, the United States Zionists brought great pressure to bear on President Wilson, and the United States entered and won the war for Great Britain and France. The British, as promised, signed the Balfour Declaration, which gave Palestine to the Jews. In his book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Professor Anthony Sutton describes how in 1933, Hitler, needing to repay huge war reparations and having to rebuild the German nation, was lent huge sums of money by international Jewish financiers such as the Warburgs, J.P. Morgan, Chase Manhattan, and Kuhn Loeb banks, who were hoping for huge profits from exorbitant interest rates. The Germans had since recognized they'd been stabbed in the back by German Zionists, and they resented this. So they were only too happy when Hitler came up with his final solution to the Jewish problem, which was an agreement reached with German Zionist groups to have 4 million European Jews either emigrate or be deported to the island of Madagascar.
The international Zionists, fearing their influence in Europe was dwindling fast, met in Amsterdam in 1933 and demanded Hitler stop the deportations immediately and take all Jews back. When Hitler defied their demands, the international Zionists, represented by Mr. Samuel Untermyer, then declared worldwide war and boycott on Germany. Hoping to maintain some form of power in Europe, the international Zionists managed to sabotage and stop the immigration of many thousands of Jews, thereby condemning these fellow Jews to imprisonment in concentration camps. After all, the Jews were engaged in a self-declared war against Germany, and this made them enemies within their own country. To quote Mr. Benjamin Friedman once again, ultimately, the Zionists were also responsible for World War II. Hitler had no plans to murder Jews. He had no plans for world domination. He was a nationalist, such as Israel, the United States, South Africa, and South America, as well as Australia. Many more Jews decided they had had enough of being Jewish, and they changed their names and religion.
The British started bombing German cities months before Germany retaliated, and more bombs were dropped on Berlin in one day than the Germans dropped on Great Britain throughout the whole war. This man, Bomber Harris, was responsible for burning alive hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children, and the British built memorials to him. This man, Rudolf Hess, flew to Scotland in 1941 in a last-ditch effort to make peace with the Allies. He was pronounced to be mad, was sentenced to life imprisonment, and over 40 years later, just before his release, British agents strangled him to death in Spandau prison. His memorial was destroyed. So, who really wanted war?
The sun on the meadow is summery.
Tonight,
liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We investigate the most extraordinary event of the 20th century.
It's one small step for man.
Man landing on the moon.
One giant leap for mankind.
But believe it or not, some people say it never happened.
This whole thing was a fake.
Decide for yourself as we explore the evidence.
The Eagle has landed.
Analyze official government photos.
What a ride, what a ride.
Examine the films.
The flag flaps on the moon where there's no atmosphere.
And hear the testimony of one former astronaut who's not afraid to speak his mind.
NASA could have covered it up.
Could the government have orchestrated the deception of the century?
NASA could have pulled off the greatest hoax of all time.
You be the judge. On Conspiracy Theory, did we land on the moon?
On July 16, 1969, America held its breath.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Apollo 11 blasted into space. beginning its 250,000-mile journey to the moon. During their 8-day voyage, the Apollo 11 astronauts saw spectacular views of the Earth, floated in a weightless environment, and supposedly went where no man had gone before.
Guys looking good, down a half. Lights on, picking up some dust. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
But did it? Did they really land on the moon? Most of us think so. Millions of people watched on television as the lunar lander touched down, and these unforgettable words were spoken.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But even today, there are those who claim that believing in man's one small step requires one giant leap of faith. Bill Kaysing was an analyst and engineer at Rocketdyne, the company that designed the Apollo rockets.
There were many problems that evolved during the 60s that led people to believe that we're never going to make it to the moon.
Three decades ago, when the world watched Apollo's lunar landings, Bill Kaysing was watching too. But what he saw on television, combined with his experiences at Rocketdyne, made him a skeptic.
The whole thing then seemed phony to me. I think it was an intuitive feeling that what was being shown was not real.
As he studied the footage more closely, he was shocked to find several inconsistencies. Kaysing observed that despite the clarity of deep space, the stars were missing from the black lunar sky. He saw the American flag waving, even though there is no air on the moon. And he discovered that there was no blast crater beneath the lunar lander, where its powerful rocket engine had fired. This evidence convinced Kaysing that we never sent a man to the moon. As outlandish as it might seem, it has been estimated that as many as 20% of Americans believe we never went to the moon. But how could anyone think that one of the greatest moments in human history is a hoax? Is it really possible that NASA deceived the world? According to a former astronaut, it's entirely possible.
Regarding the Apollo mission, I can't say 100% for sure whether these men walked on the moon.
Brian O'Leary was a NASA astronaut in the 1960s and served as a science advisor during the Apollo moon missions.
It's possible that NASA could have covered it up just in order to cut corners and to be the first to allegedly go to the moon.
Was getting to the moon first so important that our government would consider faking it? To find the answer, we have to go back 40 years, to a time when America and the Soviets were locked in a struggle for world domination.
People assumed that the nation that won the space race would win the Cold War. We defined that as being first to the moon. It was a time of more or less national hysteria.
On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets terrified America when they sent Sputnik, the world's first satellite, into orbit.
The New York Times had to publish an article explaining to Americans that it did not carry nuclear bombs that could be dropped on the city from that altitude.
The American public's fear of nuclear annihilation intensified. Fear that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal was to put a missile base on the moon. Meanwhile, America's space program was having difficulty even getting off the ground.
The chances of getting to the moon and returning safely to Earth were something like 0.0017%. In other words, virtually an impossibility.
What actually happened in my mind is that during the 60s, they said, if you can't make it, fake it.
But if the Apollo missions were fake, how was this monumental hoax accomplished? According to Casing, the launch of Apollo's Saturn V rocket was real. It just never sent astronauts to the moon.
The astronauts were launched with the Saturn V. Then, in order to account for their disappearance, they simply orbited the Earth for 8 days. And in the interim, they showed these fake pictures of the astronauts on the moon. But on the 8th day, the command capsule separated from the vehicle and descended to Earth, as of course was shown in films.
This theory inspired the 1978 movie Capricorn 1, in which the government attempts to fool the world by faking a mission to Mars.
We do not claim this planet in the name of America. We claim it in the name of all the people of the planet Earth.
The Apollo footage is strikingly similar to the scenes in Capricorn 1. Producer Paul Lazarus suggests that the film's plotline could be more fact than fiction.
I believe, had they wanted to, that NASA could indeed have pulled off the greatest hoax of all time, never sent anyone to the moon, and recreated it in a television studio. And I believe it could have been done at that time. The technology was in place.
The footing is solid. The surface seems powdery.
Surface is fine and powdery. I can pick it up loosely with my toe.
What we put up on the screen was our own simulated version of whatever we could do within a $4.8 million budget.
But with NASA's $40 billion budget, Casing believes they had the resources to pull off a hoax if they couldn't make it to the moon.
The reason I believe that NASA and the government faked the moon landing was basically it was technically impossible to do it. And they simply had to come up with some sort of alternative that they felt the public would believe.
Casing theorizes that the lunar landings were actually filmed in Nevada's high desert, at the top secret military base known as Area 51.
Area 51 is one of the most heavily guarded facilities in the United States. If you went in and tried to get some information, you could be shot and killed without any warning.
Russian spy satellite photos of Area 51 reveal not only a series of hangars that resemble movie sound stages, but also barren moon-like areas which coincidentally are covered with craters. Compare this photo of a lunar crater allegedly taken from the moon's orbit by Apollo 10 with this satellite photo of a crater at Area 51. Even astronauts acknowledge the similarity of the terrain.
It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States.
Could billions of people really have been fooled into thinking the Nevada desert was the moon? Casing believes it's possible, and maybe the real reason Area 51 is so heavily guarded.
This is a very secret base, and with good reason, because undoubtedly the moon sets are still there.
And if they are, no one's getting a look at them anytime soon. We've all been led to believe that on July 20th, 1969, the Lunar Excursion Module, also known as the LEM, carried American astronauts to the surface of the moon. But could it have simply been a prop lowered by wires onto a movie set? Bill Casing says that this may explain the absence of engine noise in the official NASA footage.
The noise level of a rocket engine is up into the 140, 150 decibel range. In other words, enormously loud. How would it be possible to hear astronauts' voices against the background of a running rocket engine?
Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
Is this evidence that the footage is actually fake? A sequence shot in a controlled environment here on Earth? Just months before this historic landing, a prototype LEM was flight tested at Ellington Air Force Base. While NASA cameras record the test flight, Neil Armstrong struggles to control the unwieldy craft. Then, at approximately 300 feet, the lander flies wildly out of control. At the last second, Armstrong ejects. And floats to safety. If the lander was so unstable and difficult to fly in the controlled environment of Earth, then how could the LEM land 6 times flawlessly in the alien environment of the Moon?
The LEM had a single engine mounted dead center, and then they had little push jets, thruster jets, a couple of them up on top. This was supposed to control their attitude as they came down. Well, I'll tell you a secret. The instant you moved your tail in that cabin an inch, you would change the load pattern, it would begin to tilt, and it would start that thing spinning.
But conspiracy theorists say that the footprints themselves are suspicious.
The surface appears to be very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder.
To have a powerful rocket engine blast the surface of the moon, blasting away all of the dust, and then find footprints surrounding the lunar lander, that to me would be an impossibility.
Photo after photo reveals that the lunar surface surrounding the LEM is covered with footprints. But Casing says there's something even more difficult to explain.
The fact that there's no blast crater under the LEM is one of the most conclusive pieces of evidence that I find supporting the hoax.
In fact, no sign of a blast crater is visible for any of the 6 lunar landings. Yet NASA's own scientific illustrations clearly depict a blast crater.
Then there's one other point. If they had truly landed on the moon, this dust would have then descended on the lunar lander, on the foot pads, and we find not a trace of dust on the foot pads. When I discovered that alone, I said, no way am I looking at a lunar lander that landed on the moon.
Could it be that the LEM was just a prop on a giant lunar movie set?
When Armstrong said, that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind, the footprint that he made could have easily been made in Area 51.
Casing points out that the LEM's departure from the lunar surface is even more suspicious.
In the footage of the ascent stage going up, what you don't see is an exhaust plume coming out of the rocket engine nozzle.
What a ride, what a ride.
But what do we see? We see the ascent stage suddenly pop up without any exhaust plume whatsoever, as though it were jerked up by a cable.
Is this evidence of a conspiracy? Was the government capable of such a massive cover-up?
To propose,
I would say that my conviction that Apollo was a fake was really not according to one specific piece of evidence, but it was cumulative. This whole thing was a fake.
Coming up.
We're getting a picture on the TV.
If there's no air on the moon, why is this American flag waving? Plus, could these official NASA photos have been doctored?
All of the photographs were faked.
And later, is it possible for humans to have survived the deadly radiation in deep space?
If the moon landings were actually filmed on a movie set, then where's the evidence? According to David Percy, an award-winning filmmaker and photographer, the proof is in NASA's own lunar photos and video.
Our research suggests that images of the Apollo landings are not a true and accurate record. In our view, the Apollo pictures were faked. many of the images are replete with inconsistencies and anomalies.
In fact, Percy claims that when examined, these images suggest that man never went to the moon at all. This famous scene of man taking his first steps on the lunar surface is one of the most recognizable in history. But why are such important images so grainy and hard to see?
And we're getting a picture on the TV. You got a good picture, huh?
NASA claims it's the result of 1960s technology. But investigative journalist Bart Sabrell believes that NASA intentionally made the images hard to see.
NASA orchestrated the hoax in a very unique way through television. They had one picture which they completely controlled, black and white, grainy, that convinced everybody we were on the moon. We had no reason to doubt it. They had complete reins over the pictures, over the sound. I mean, sad to say, it was easier than people believe.
But despite the lack of clarity, conspiracy theorists see evidence suggesting that these images were staged.
It's absolutely unreal.
Although it appears that the astronauts are moving in the moon's gravity, which is 1/6 that of the Earth, Percy notes that when the speed of the film is doubled, the astronauts appear to be running as if in Earth's gravity. Also, when the footage of the lunar rover is doubled in speed, it looks as if it's driving here on Earth. But there's another reason some believe the Apollo missions were shot on Earth. If there is no air or wind on the moon, why is this American flag waving?
The fact that the flag flaps on the moon where there's no atmosphere means that there must have been a little blast of wind out in Area 51 where they shot this.
Could these questionable images simply be the result of astronauts struggling to plant the flag into the lunar surface? Or is there more going on than meets the eye? What about the still photography? Some say the design of the bulky spacesuits would have made it extremely difficult for the astronauts to operate their chest-mounted cameras. The man who designed these cameras is Jan Lundberg.
Once on the moon, on the lunar surface, in the dress, in the life support system, you couldn't see the camera. They couldn't bend their head that far down. They had no viewfinder, they had to aim by moving their body.
Click, click, click.
If the cameras were so difficult to manipulate, how were thousands of photos taken with crystal clarity and precise framing?
The pictures that we see that allegedly were taken on the moon are absolutely perfect.
But with closer examination, Casing says flaws begin to emerge.
Unfortunately, errors were made which are now being discovered.
Conspiracy theorists point out that lighting is a major flaw in the lunar photos. Case in point, on the moon, the astronauts' only source of light was the sun.
They had no extra lighting, no flashes or things like that.
Yet in this photograph from Apollo 14, the shadows are cast in different directions, suggesting multiple light sources.
The shadows cast by the rocks in the foreground should have been east-west, like the LEM shadow.
And in this photo from Apollo 17, again the shadows are pointing in different directions.
Outside in sunlight, shadows always run parallel with one another. So the shadows will never intersect.
Conspiracy theorists say it's not just the shadows that indicate the use of additional lights, but what has been photographed in the shadows. For example, here's an astronaut who descends into a huge shadow cast by the lunar module. Yet his entire body is still visible. How is it that he is not shrouded in darkness? Here's the same maneuver from another Apollo mission. Again, the astronaut is brightly lit in what is obviously dark shadow. And in this picture, the sun is directly behind the astronaut. His figure should be a silhouette. Yet even the smallest characteristics of his suit are recognizable.
It seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why?
And finally, in this picture with the sun behind the lunar module, the front of the craft is clearly visible. The words United States are crisp and clear. How could these backlit pictures be so detailed?
It's because there's more than one light source, which means they're not on the moon.
But NASA simply dismisses these arguments. But the questions continue. Why do some of these images shot at different times and different places appear to have identical backgrounds? These two photos seem to have the same mountain backdrop, yet the lunar module is only present in one of them. Seemingly impossible, since the LEM never moved and its base remained even after the mission.
What a ride, what a ride.
Some suggest the same artificial backdrop was used when shooting two entirely separate pictures. Background discrepancies are also apparent in the lunar video.
The best evidence are some pictorial anomalies in the photographic record of the trip to the moon. There is one for Apollo 16 where the same shot, the same hill, appears in 2 different days.
This tape was shot on what was reported to be the first of Apollo 16's lunar excursions.
But it couldn't pick a better spot.
And this video was from the next day at a different location.
That is the most beautiful sight.
NASA claims the second location was 2.5 miles away. But when one video is superimposed over the other, the locations appear identical.
The conspiracy theorists see that as evidence that we didn't go to the moon, that it was staged, and the opposite point of view is that it's a case of bad editing.
It's absolutely unreal.
Conspiracy theorists claim that even closer examination of the photos suggest evidence of doctoring. For reference, crosshairs were permanently etched into the lunar cameras, so they would have to appear on top of every image. But in this photo, a crosshair is behind a part of the lunar rover.
This situation is impossible and has to be the result of technical manipulation and doctoring of the image.
And in this photo from Apollo 11, the equipment in the foreground is covering the crosshair, not behind it. And in another from Apollo 12, the American flag is covering one crosshair and the astronaut is covering the other. When presented with these questionable photos and videos, NASA refutes the conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theorists still insist that Apollo was a hoax.
When I looked at all the pictures and all the footage, I'm absolutely convinced, I bet my life on it, that we didn't go to the moon. I know for a fact that we didn't.
If what conspiracy theorists say is true, how could NASA perpetrate such a widespread hoax without someone from the inside blowing the whistle? Virgil Gus Grissom was selected as one of the original 7 astronauts. A family man and a veteran of several space flights, he was a national hero and was likely to be the first man to walk on the moon. But Grissom was also an outspoken critic of the space program and was quoted as saying, "Someone's going to get killed." Unfortunately, Grissom's worst fears were soon realized. On January 27, 1967, 2 years before the first moon landing, Grissom and his crew boarded the Apollo 1 capsule for a full-scale simulation. The problems began almost immediately. First, the capsule's communication systems failed.
You copy? No, I didn't read you, Chuck, at all. I can't read you, Chuck. You want to try the phone? Hey, how do I get the moon? We can't fly between 3 buildings. I can't hear a thing you're saying.
Suddenly, the capsule burst into flames with the astronauts sealed inside. Tragically, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives before ever leaving the launch pad. Gus Grissom's family believes the Apollo 1 fire was no accident.
I think it was intentionally sabotaged by someone. It's been a question in my mind, what was found in the accident investigation and how was that handled? Was the CIA involved or whoever? But it was done intentionally.
Grissom's family doesn't know who was responsible for his death or why it happened. But they say NASA knows the truth.
Gus gave his life for this program, and I feel like that it is up to NASA to come forward and give us a direct answer to what really happened.
Were Gus Grissom and the Apollo 1 astronauts victims of a tragic accident? Or were they intentionally silenced because they knew too much? We may never know. The cause of the fire is still a mystery, and the capsule remains locked away at a military base. But Grissom wasn't the only Apollo critic to meet with a suspicious and untimely death. Thomas Ronald Barron was a safety inspector during Apollo 1's construction. After the fire, Barron testified before Congress that the Apollo program was in such disarray that the United States would never make it to the moon. He claimed his opinions made him a target.
Has there been any pressure on you by NASA?
Nothing. We were, my wife and I were somewhat harassed at home when this first thing broke some time back, but it's gone away now.
As part of his testimony, Barron submitted a 500-page report detailing his findings.
There was a real fear that the program could be stopped dead in its tracks.
Then exactly 1 week after he testified, Barron's car was struck by a train. Barron, his wife, and stepdaughter were killed instantly.
I believe that Thomas Ronald Barron was murdered because he had the truth to tell about the Apollo project.
Barron's report mysteriously disappeared, and to this day, it has never been found. But the Apollo program continued, and so did the string of untimely deaths. Between 1964 and 1967, a total of 10 astronauts lost their lives in freak accidents. These deaths accounted for an astonishing 15% of NASA's astronaut corps.
To keep something that's alive wrapped up and covered over, you've got to eliminate all the people that can talk about it.
Could the government have gone this far to pull off such an elaborate hoax? NASA says it's impossible. But Bart Sabrell insists that most NASA employees knew nothing of the deception.
Very few people at NASA knew. The thing is so departmentalized. You got the person building the bolts in Houston, or doing this in Seattle, or doing this in Florida. No one knows the full picture. So, you had no one seeing the full picture of anything except a handful of people.
If the conspiracy theorists are right, and only a few people knew the whole story, then the truth may remain buried forever.
When we return, could the astronauts have survived the deadly radiation of space?
Getting them past the radiation belt would have been impossible.
And a Russian cosmonaut breaks his silence.
Suspicious deaths, evidence of doctored photos, and flags waving in the airless vacuum of space are not the only reasons to doubt that we ever went to the moon. Some say the astronauts could never even have survived the trip.
The reason why they couldn't go to the moon is because of a phenomenon that few people know about called the Van Allen radiation belts.
500 miles above the Earth, these bands of intense radiation surround our planet and are thousands of miles thick.
Any human being traveling through the Van Allen belt would have been rendered either extremely ill or actually killed by the radiation within a short time thereafter.
Other than the Apollo missions, no other manned space flight has attempted to pass through this deadly radiation.
Every manned mission in history, Gemini, Mercury, Skylab to Space Shuttle, has been below the radiation belt, all except going to the moon.
To protect the astronauts, the capsule would have needed 6 feet of lead shielding, according to physicist Ralph Rene.
Obviously, the only shielding they had was the literally paper-thin outer hull of aluminum, and their suits consisting of glass fiber, some aluminum fibers, and silicon rubber.
It's very interesting concerning radiation that the astronauts were protected by a thin film of aluminum when here on Earth they put a lead shield on us when they take a dental x-ray.
Some theorize that if the Van Allen belts didn't kill the astronauts, even deadlier doses of radiation deeper in space would have. Violent explosions in the sun called magnetic storms flood space with intense radioactivity.
A magnetic storm will come along, and that can increase the intensity of the radiation belts by maybe 1,000 times above what it was before.
According to Rene, the Apollo 16 mission coincided with one of the sun's most intense storms ever recorded.
Around the rotating sun came this immense flare, the biggest one of the 20th century. It went on for 3 or 4 days. All the while it's slowly rotating around.
Although the effects of radiation are horrific, ranging from hair loss to cancer to death, the solar flares had no adverse effect on the Apollo 16 crew.
NASA had another problem, and one is that the moon's surface is totally inhospitable to man. If you do it in the dark, and that includes any part of the shadow of the spacecraft itself, the temperatures go down to 250 degrees below zero. In the sun, the temperatures go up to 250 degrees above zero.
Rene also theorizes that the astronauts' liquid-cooled spacesuits could not have provided sufficient protection from the intense heat and radiation. But NASA maintains that this hypothesis is wrong.
If those suits do what NASA says they can do, then I want to see them suit up a guy or two, put him into 3 Mile Island, the pit there that's still hot, and have them clean up the mess. But they can't and they don't.
The fact remains that no Apollo astronaut has ever suffered a serious illness from a trip to the moon. Could this be because they never left the safety of Earth's atmosphere in the first place?
This is the main reason why the Russians never really intended to send the men to the moon.
Was it the fear of lethal radiation that caused the Russians to abandon their plans to go to the moon? According to one of their chief cosmonauts, it was certainly a factor.
Of course, we were worried to go out into the unknown of space. Of course, we were fearful. We had no idea how a human would be affected by the radiation. We suspected that possibly the radiation could even penetrate through the craft itself.
Are the deadly perils of space proof that NASA faked the Apollo missions? To this day, the Russians have never sent a man to the moon. And we have no plans to return. Now that you have heard the various theories and explanations, do you believe it's possible for our government to perpetrate such an incredible hoax? Is it conceivable that with its $40 billion price tag, the Apollo program was nothing more than the most expensive movie ever made?
It is my personal belief, and I totally believe this after all the years of research I've done on this, that NASA never landed a man on the moon.
Anyone that wants to call me a kook or a nut or a crackpot, they're welcome to do that, but they're also welcome to go examine the evidence, which is everywhere.
Is there any way to put this controversy to rest once and for all? The only thing the experts agree upon is that the answer is 250,000 miles away. If NASA truly landed on the moon, remnants of the 6 successful Apollo missions would have been left behind. The base structures of the LEMs, the abandoned lunar rovers. Even the American flags would still be standing at each landing site.
I would like to invite NASA and all of their supporters to simply take the most powerful telescope on Earth and see if there's a lunar lander there. If there's a lunar lander there, I'll never say another word about an Apollo hoax. If there's no lunar lander there, I'll rest my case.
But no telescope exists that can examine the moon in such detail. Do objects from the Apollo missions remain on the moon in silent testimony? Or is the conspiracy theory true?
In the annals of human history, perhaps the last age, the space age. Competition for victor was unparalleled. Powerful nations spent billions in unabashed rivalry to outdo the other. The Soviet Union launched the first orbiting satellite, the first animal, the first man. They had logged 500% more hours in space than the United States. And in June of 1969, they launched an unmanned probe to the moon to retrieve the first soil sample from another world, just 1 month before Apollo 11. That's how close the race was. Had their unmanned probe not crash-landed into the lunar surface, the first moon rock brought back to Earth would have been by the Soviet Union. Richard Nixon, president at the time, had this to say about the latest work of the human hand. It is the greatest week since creation, the greatest event since the laying of the foundation of the seas, since the origin of the universe itself, since the design and formation of the delicate human eye through which all these things are perceived, was a flying machine with its 2 passengers landing on its closest celestial neighbor and returning from where it came. Perhaps again, God's irony lies somewhere within this great boast of humankind. The building of the tallest tower for the sole purpose of standing out among the races was never finished. The machine that was so great that it was said to be untouchable by even God never completed its first voyage. And finally, the crowning achievement of humankind, the greatest boast of the species, the event in human history most associated with pride in our own accomplishments, landing on the moon. 20 years later, and years behind schedule, the same space program couldn't put into Earth orbit a telescope with a lens that focused. And yet 2 decades earlier, a mission 100 times more complicated worked on its first occasion. With close scrutiny of the motives of the zealous Nixon administration, a critical examination of the entirely government-controlled press coverage, and newly discovered footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission, we wish to detail what may come to be the greatest government conspiracy of all time. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo. The more experienced Soviets spent 100 hours in space for every 20 hours of the US. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. the mammoth Saturn V rocket used by Apollo was already 35 stories tall and weighed as much as a battleship. To add additional tonnage in the form of a lead barrier completely surrounding the crew members would have made it impossible for the vehicle to get off the ground. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum. In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects. President Kennedy, a man of political, not scientific background, set the irrevocable goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, just days after America's first astronaut had spent a mere 16 minutes in space, not even achieving a single orbit around the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful.
The technology necessary to launch the massive Saturn V rocket and an intercontinental ballistic missile is 95% similar. When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. When they also put the first animal in space, then the first man in space, then achieved the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, and the first ever of 2 simultaneously orbiting spacecrafts, concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up.
President, a member of Congress said today that he was tired of seeing the United States second to Russia in the space field. I suppose he speaks for a lot of others. What is the prospect that we will catch up with Russia and perhaps surpass Russia in this field?
However tired anybody may be, and no one is more tired than I am, it is a fact that it's going to take some time, and I think we have to recognize it. They secured these large boosters, which have led to their being first in Sputnik and led to their first putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able to carry out our efforts with due regard to the problem of the life of the man involved this year. But we are behind.
If it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In World War II, for example, columns of inflatable tanks were placed at locations afar from Normandy to draw German forces away from the real location of invasion. The Star Wars missile defense program rigged tests to make it seem more advanced than it really was. That's the conclusion of the General Accounting Office. The aim was to fool the Soviet Union about US military readiness during the Cold War. Certainly, it was not possible to fool just the Soviets about US strategic capability in the 1960s, while somehow informing 200 million Americans of the truth secretly. In order for them to believe the United States had the capability to go to the moon, everyone would have to believe it. Furthermore, the pride of a nation was at stake, and the goal of a martyr, not to mention the growing unrest domestically of a government throwing tens of thousands of lives away in a foreign war riddled with contradiction and ambiguity. In addition, the Apollo program had already spent billions of dollars. If it failed to achieve its goal with such an investment, it would indeed be a large and bitter pill for the taxpayers to swallow. The cost of the program, whose sole goal was to be the first to plant a flag on the lifeless rock just outside the Earth, if adjusted for inflation to the 21st century, was $135 billion. With a profit margin of just 7%, this would be equal to over $9 billion profit going to the privileged contractors chosen by their friends at NASA. If the machinery was in fact only achieving Earth orbit, as other earlier missions had already done, then the completion and functionality of the other components would not have been as important, and even more profit would have been made. $135 billion could feed 2 million people for their entire lives. It could also buy 2 million two-bedroom houses. Yet how could such an undertaking be kept secret, and for such a long time? To the latter, one needs only to remember that an unsolved riddle 6 years older, the assassination of President Kennedy, still daunts the minds of the vast majority of Americans. As a parent of a conspiracy, as his assassin being assassinated himself, the truth of the matter has still escaped history. In keeping a secret of the magnitude of the Apollo missions being fraudulently created, one turns to the Manhattan Project for comparison. Surreptitiously building the first nuclear bomb during the early to mid-1940s involved 129,500 people over a 3-year period. Yet the secret did not get out. A quarter century later, the art and technology of espionage inevitably improved, narrowing dramatically the number of players in the know of a large clandestine operation. Just 1 year before the first mission to the moon, NASA launched the Tetra satellite, specifically designed to simulate flight data coming from the moon, so that the ground crews could rehearse the landing, much as the astronauts did in their own simulations. Had it not supposedly fallen back to Earth, all that would have been needed during the actual flight would be a repeat of one of these computer programs, with a few original variations, transmitted to the satellite for rebroadcast to Houston. Scores of computers and their deceived operators on the ground would then receive prearranged information, including the alleged location, altitude, and fuel consumption of the spacecraft, as if it were descending to the moon's surface. If the Soviets tried to find the actual location of an Apollo crew in the hundreds of thousands of miles surrounding the Earth and the moon, it would be tantamount to trying to find a rowboat in the Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture. And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public were strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true? And what of the photographs? What do they tell us? On 3 separate occasions, our office asked NASA's Public Relations Department for every single picture of an astronaut on the surface of the moon, just during the maiden voyage of Apollo 11. Many duplicates were sent. In all, fewer than 20 pictures were found, including first-hand investigation on site at the agency's vaulted archives. Quite surprising, considering the historical significance of the event. These very photographs are the same ones circulated year after year on anniversary commemorations. It is estimated that in just the first 60 minutes on the Moon, motivated by the tenuous nature of the circumstances, many more exposures could have been expediently taken. Also surprising is the scarcity of photographs of the mission's chief pioneer, Neil Armstrong, the greatest achievement in human history, and of the man whose first step echoed around the world, dawning a new age of scientific enlightenment. There is only one full-body picture of him on the Moon, besides this ghostly reflection. This one, taken by an automatic camera mounted on the side of the lunar module. Perhaps he feared liability should the whole conundrum later become unraveled. Perhaps he has forgotten that he attested to the authenticity of the event with his signature on this plaque engraved by the federal government. In fact, in the more than 30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, he has never given one on-camera interview to anyone, ever. From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the Moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom-seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the Moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? Or this, on the shadow side of the lunar module. In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably airbrushed out. Here, a crosshair, which was burned directly into the image from the film plate, and thus should always appear on top of the objects in the photograph, appears behind the object in this scene, clearly revealing a composite of two pictures into one. Someone apparently forgot to create a burn crater underneath the lunar module's 10,000-pound thrust engine, despite the fact that during ground tests there was a real concern for the vehicle falling into the hole the engine created as it descended. Here is a depiction based on the latest specifications and scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there. Not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere. And what about stars? On the Moon, with no atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly, creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately, much less realistically. A competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars. Ever. In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the Moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the Sona Corolla what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon. It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside, after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny. To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen color television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution color video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all, it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven. And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr., and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. We're coming in on Earth.
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private. Until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we were seeing. Thank you very much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue cast, see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway. It thus confirms that the stumbling block to their success was the lethal radiation of the Van Allen radiation belts. Since the same equipment was used on the subsequent missions in the 40 months that followed, none of them could have gone to the moon. They only increased their proficiency at staging them. When some TV viewers of the second manned mission to the moon telephoned the networks complaining that reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted, it became clear that for the taxpayers, once was enough. But it wasn't enough for the government and contractors. Billions of dollars of pure profit went with each return. How coincidental that the following mission would have the element of life and death jeopardy. Apollo 13. Now the public would take going to the moon more seriously and be reconnected with the drama. We now realize that perhaps the reason Neil Armstrong has never given an on-camera interview is because he doesn't want to lie anymore. What threats may have been made upon such honorable men or their families to possess their reluctant cooperation and later ill feelings towards perpetuating this still darkened hour in American history. NASA's highest-ranking official, James Webb, resigned without explanation just days before the first Apollo mission. Why, when he was on the threshold of achieving the greatest accomplishment of his career? All 3 Apollo 11 astronauts also resigned shortly after their return. On the 25th anniversary of the event, in 1994, Neil Armstrong made a rare public appearance and held back tears as he spoke these brief cryptic remarks before the next generation of taxpayers as they toured the White House.
Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
He is that layer. Perhaps someday soon, with the uncovering of this footage and its meaning, the true patriots of America will rise up or come forward and free the citizens and themselves from the sin that so easily entangles and from a federal government that needs to have the gangrene cut off. Even if the government's destruction would come from the truth, then it is not worthy to stand, and its betterment would inevitably follow. All of us are mortal. All of us will die. Perhaps the seeking of a clear conscience before that hour will motivate the truth into the light. Perhaps as citizens we should offer amnesty for this and other crimes of history, for facts from those involved, before the truth perishes with them. Why must we wait until the year 2017 to open the Kennedy assassination files? Perhaps they will not even be opened then, for the law that reluctantly stipulates their release says so with this clause, quote, with the exception of documents certified for continued postponement by the President. Whoever believes the citizens to be too immature for the truth are too immature for power. The truth will always set us free.
Now look at all these articles and documents and notes I've got. Hell, I got to do a good job with all you great people out here. You know, like I said earlier when I introduced that documentary we just showed, I am humbled by meeting you. I'm humbled by talking to you. And I know that it's in people like you that we're going to turn this around. Because we don't have a choice. How many times have we been lied to? How many times have we caught the system doing everything it can, not just to rob us, but to try to ruin our lives so that we're weak and poor and dominated by them so they can control our destiny? I don't like that. I want to see humanity doing well. I want to see humanity empowered. You know, my dad's a dentist, and at least once a year for more than 20 years, he's gone to Latin America to be part of these free clinics for these different doctors' organizations that take care of kids. And he's told me the same stories that my uncle told me, who did years of work as a missionary in Central and South America. And he said, you know, you don't appreciate life, even though my uncle was in Vietnam, a helicopter pilot, until you see children at orphanages where the orphanages don't even have the money to pay for food, and there's little kids with their rib cages sticking out. That's what we're talking about. You have to realize, I have to realize, and really let it burn into our brains, that more than 15 million children, according to the UN and their own numbers, it's probably higher, 15 million children a year starve to death on this planet, and another 20 million adults. And are in the world, we didn't have the corrupt elites on top of us trying to shut down human destiny, shut down human ingenuity and creativity because they're threatened by it, because they want a monopoly. Because the United States only had a few glimmers and moments of freedom, we developed the highest test scores. We developed the most scientific developments. We created the media and the literature and the art and the music that has conquered the world. And the globalists, the global scientific engineers saw that. They were aware of that. They knew that. And so they did everything they could to take that over and to take our energies and turn it against humanity. So now America is in a paradox. America, right here at this center place where we live, make no mistake, is where the battle will be fought. It's where the decisions will be made. We are the great evil empire, but we are also the great deliverer from the tyranny. But we have to decide who we are. That's why the struggle between good and evil is being decided here. because we have the birthright of liberty, because we have the basic freedom, because we are armed like no other nation on earth. The globalists have not taken this republic. All right, I've never been able to do this on the radio. I can never get to the second point without going off into rants. It may be a bad speech, it may be the best ever, but I'm going to attempt, with your help, to go through all these points. All right, I'll start at the top. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank my crew, but I also want to thank all of you. I love that Teddy Roosevelt quote. I should have had it here so I could quote it properly, but forget the critic, the person who's not in the arena. What matters is the person who is in the arena, who knows the great challenges, the great struggles. Because even if you fail, at least you tried to dare greatly. That's what matters. It's trying. That's where it all starts, is taking action. That's what's fulfilling. And I want to say this to you here now.
You rolling? What happened on 9/11 is a phony, you know, and we've never learned the truth about 9/11. The whole agenda is to create a one-world government where everybody has an RFID chip implanted in them. All money is to be in those chips. And this is given me straight from Rockefeller himself. This is what they want to accomplish. Aaron, what do you think women's liberation was about? We, the Rockefellers, funded that. We funded women's lib. They do whatever they want to do. What we want doesn't matter anymore. It's their agenda, it's their plans that matter. They have all the money they want. They can make all the money they want. They have a machine that can make all the money. It's not about money. It's about control. It's about their vision of how they want to see the world. You hear George Bush saying democracy means freedom. No. Democracy equals New World Order. I believe God put me on this earth to be the best person I could be, and put everybody on this earth to be the best they can be. You have to stand up for what's right in life. And unless you do that, you're nothing.
Award-winning filmmaker turned freedom fighter, Aaron Russo was an amazing individual. You know, he'd been battling cancer for more than 3.5 years when he began making America Freedom to Fascism, that he shot, directed, edited pretty much on his own with just the help of a few people. An amazing individual. A long life of award-winning films, of hard work, and for standing up for the Bill of Rights and Constitution. You know, when we first went and shot this interview, I put it out on the web for free. But parts of it have never been seen. So here today, you're going to have a chance to see the in-depth interview, the final interview with Aaron Russo. But his important work lives on. You know, he made one of the definitive films exposing the elite that control this nation and the world, the private Federal Reserve. And the information he put out 2 years ago rings more true today than ever. And his film, America Freedom to Fascism, and Mad as Hell, and the other great works he did just continue like ripples in a pond to light bushfires in the minds of men and women everywhere. So this film is dedicated to the one, the only, Aaron Russo.
You rolling? I'm honored to be interviewed by Alex Jones, a truth seeker, fighting for justice in America.
Alex charming is getting me all smiling.
Aaron, when did you start to think something was wrong in the world, or start to find out about the whole banking cartel and the Federal Reserve System, the New World Order?
Well, that was a progression of events. I've always been a very independent person, always believed in individuality, and that we were put on this earth to be unique individuals to fulfill our God-given potential, and that the only way to fulfill your potential is to be free, to find out who you are, and to make your errors, to make mistakes. And as I grew up, I began to realize more and more the government was inhibiting me in things that I wanted to do. And what happened, I was very successful in the ladies' lingerie business. I worked for my dad. He had a small undergarment business. and I created the first ladies' bikini panties back in 1963, actually. And then I opened up a nightclub in Chicago called the Electric Theater that opened up the day Martin Luther King was assassinated. Wow. All right, and so the city of Chicago was in flames the day my club opened, and nobody came out to the club. And well, what happened was that that was the year of the Democratic Convention in Chicago in '68. And so my club became a hangout for the hippies, you know, and because they wanted to go to Chicago and protest what was going on. And I was having a concert at my club one night to raise money, and the police raided the nightclub, my club for no reason at all. And I was standing outside in my office overlooking the street, and I saw all these paddy wagons pulling up in front of my club. And I was a 24-year-old kid. You know, I had no experience at all, really. So what are these paddy wagons doing here? And then I saw all these cops getting out of the paddy wagons coming into my club. I said, oh my God, they're raiding me. And so I ran down to the stage, and I got on the stage, and I stopped the band from playing. And I said to the people in the audience, we're being raided, you know, so sit down on the floor, cooperate, and pull out your identification and cooperate with the police. And as I said that, two of the cops from behind threw me onto the floor and grabbed me and started dragging me out of the club. I'm going, you know, victory, victory. You know, I'm playing it for all it was worth at the time. I was a kid. And then I saw the fire department there. And the fire department was dumping garbage cans, the garbage all over the floor. And I thought to myself, well, why are they doing that? You know, very quickly as they were dragging me out. And I didn't quite understand it. So they threw me into the paddy wagon. As I got into the paddy wagon, one of the cops grabbed my testicles from behind and squeezed, and I went into the paddy wagon in gigantic pain. And the next person that came into the paddy wagon, the cop, as he was stepping in, the cops took the billy club, smashed him on the head with it, and just split his skull. I thought about it. I was attracted to it, you know. They asked me if I wanted to open up these nightclubs, you know, open up a chain of Baywatch nightclubs, you know, and we'll do this thing, we'll do that, and we can do this. I mean, all these things were proposed to me, business ventures. But
You know what it is? It was your nature, though. It's the way you are. You couldn't take the deal.
Well, I can't do that to people. I just can't be in a position where I can do that to other people. I have a conscience, and my conscience would not permit me to do that. You know, people say I'm very courageous. I don't think I'm courageous. I think I have a conscience, and my conscience doesn't allow me to do that to people. It makes me feel sick. You know, I just don't believe in it.
No, I agree. When I do bad things, I feel bad. When I do good things, I feel good.
Yeah, exactly. I feel the same way. And I mean, I don't know what's going to come out.
I mean, I don't have that much money, but I've got some money. I mean, it's like, what more do I need? I can go on a trip if I want. I can help pay for my kids to go to school and have my life, you know, comfortable. I mean, how do I go out and screw people so I can have some more junk?
Well, you know, money's a funny thing. You know, I was talking to Michael Eisner one day, and I said to Michael, you know, you may have $1 billion, Michael, but they're all dollars. You know, if the dollar goes bad, how much money are you going to have? You know, and that's the thing. You know, everything is denominated in dollars. Everybody thinks in terms of dollars, but the dollar has no value. And then someday it's you know, everything returns to the mean.
Well, really, the whole universe, financial universe we live in, is a matrix fraud.
Yes, it is. And that's why it's going to come crashing at some point. And they're going to try and hold up as long as they can. I mean, whenever they want to manipulate the markets, they can. If they want to send the price to go down lower, they can. If they want to send the stock market up, they can. They do that. There's no more free markets. You don't live in a society where free markets rule anymore. You don't live in a capitalistic society. You know.
But meanwhile, they say it's capitalistic and free market all day, when really they're waging war financially and politically.
Exactly right.
Aaron Russo, I want to thank you for this interview. Anything else you want to add?
No, I'm happy to do it for you.
How about your website?
My website, freedomtofascism.com. Go over there, take a look at it. You know, but just folks, you know, all I can say is, you know, take our country back, restore the Constitution. Don't let these bankers do this to us anymore. Stand up. Don't be afraid of them. And do what you got to do, you know. And I have plans in the works. And when I get over my problems, we'll reveal them, And
Well, I'll be supportive of that.
Thank you, Alex. And listen, you've done a great job alerting people to the truth. And don't, in other words, don't be afraid to be ridiculed by these people. If 9/11 was a phony, and I know it was, then stand up and say it's a phony. Don't be scared to tell the truth. Don't allow their powers of trying to make you look silly to frighten you.
What do you think of what Charlie Sheen did?
I love what Charlie Sheen did. I was so respectful of what he did. I just applauded him.
People saw right through that attack. They flipped a light switch when they went after him.
Yeah, but they don't. You see, the thing is that more people don't come out and do it. To build that wave. Charlie did it. I'm really proud of the guy.
David Lynch did. But the media was smart and didn't bite this time.
Right. I mean, a few people have, but they're not picking up on it because they control the media.
James Brolin did on The View.
I heard that as well. But again, they're not picking up.
Barbara Walters looked like she's about to have a heart attack.
But they don't pick up on it. You see, they don't allow it to go anywhere. It comes if someone says something, they let it die. But they keep perpetuating, the war on terrorism. They keep perpetuating all these things that are lies. And because we've given the Federal Reserve the money-making power, they control the media, they control the government, and they're all in bed together. So you're fighting all this propaganda all the time. And it's a very difficult fight.
Americans, mobilize. Stand together, stand tall. Tell the government you're mad as hell. No longer cooperate with the government. Do not accept the national ID card. Do everything in your power to restore freedom and your individuality back to America. Stop being a country run by the institutions for the institutions. Let's go back to we the people, by the people, for the people, as opposed to we the institution, by the institution, for the institution. Stand up for your individual rights. Stand up for the godliness that's in each and every one of us.
Thank you for watching this historic interview with Aaron Russo. Please don't just stand down after watching this film. Research the Private Federal Reserve for yourself. Realize it is the main head on the Hydra that we have to go after. Realize that we can fight the political parties all day, but until we go after the heart, the root of the problem, nothing's going to get better. We have this ruling class of private bankers that issue all this fiat currency, and they have committed unbelievable crimes and have the audacity to claim that they're above the law. Ladies and gentlemen, now more than ever, we don't have a choice. It's us or them. Either the New World Order is removed from power, or the world faces more wars, more tyranny, and a nightmarish police state carried out by these eugenicists. So in the memory of Aaron Russo and every other freedom lover out there in history, and for the future of our children and the species, humanity itself, let's call for grand jury investigations of the Private Federal Reserve. Let's arrest the bankers. Let's kick these foreign corporate criminals out of our country and get our constitutional republic back. Let's stop being distracted and diverted by the liberal and conservative puppets they stick up in our faces on television. Let's look past the front men to the actual architects of the New World Order and bring them to justice. There's no way these arrogant bastards can get away with this if we expose them and speak out against them. And more, it's coming out even in the mainstream media that they are a pack of criminals who are above the law and who have hijacked our nation. But they're only above the law in our minds. We have to expose them as the criminals they are and bring them to justice. Look in the mirror. You are the solution. Take action and join the ranks of folks like Aaron Russo, Ron Paul, and so many others. God bless you all, and thank you for watching this presentation. Now spread the word about the true enemy of the people in the Fed, in the New World Order, in the hegemony of private central bankers.
So that was that. So now I presented you the truth. You are now awakened. You now know the truth. So America needs to wake up. America needs to have a revolution. America needs to be a free country. America, I think, needs more freedoms than it ever has, because America has just illegitimate country, has become an illegitimate country. I've exposed to you how fascist America has become. I exposed to you how tyrannical America has become, and now you know the truth. So that's pretty much it, guys. And that's all I gotta say. And guys, I'm Comrade Darkslayer, over and out. And see you later, and see you around. Peace out and bye.